let's turn to our final guest of the day. Virginia Kochis is the author of Quirky Catholic Kids, out from Sophia Institute Press. Virginia, thank you for coming on the Catholic Morning Show.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
It is wonderful to have you with us. Now, your subtitle is Navigating Neurodivergence with Faith and Joy. I got to say, I'm the lucky dad of 2 out of 5 kids that are also neurodivergent. And so Faith and Joy is obviously something that is chock full and ready there for people. And maybe that's one of the things to start with is oftentimes when people are talking about neurodivergence, it rightfully points out some of the challenges and things like this. But headlining joy and especially faith involved in that, why is that so important when dealing with folks with neurodivergence?
I think it's important that, people know that everyone is made uniquely and unrepeatably. And so, when a child is diagnosed as neurodivergent, it comes with it a lot of emotions, a lot of feelings. I think especially as moms, I know for me, I felt like this wasn't at all what I planned. It wasn't going the way that I thought it was going to go. And so I think focusing on the faith and the joy aspect, it's finding the beautiful elements of, what is so special about our kids, about the talents that they have, the strengths that they have, the people they wouldn't be if they weren't neurodivergent. And I think, knowing that God has a hand in that and in creating them exactly the way he wanted them to be, I think that's really important for helping neurodivergent families live to their fullest.
And one of the things that's interesting, of course, now our oldest is 19 years old, and to think about a near 2 decades of difference between not only in popular culture and different, but in general, but even in the church, of sort of, understanding what that means for instance, for a kid to be on the spectrum of autism. I remember early on my wife and I saying, if we could just get a T-shirt that said, like, this is what we're dealing with, so he's not being rude, or you're not, But you kind of get at this, too, with the word quirky. You choose this purposefully, right? This is a way in saying that, societal expectations for children run in all sorts of different directions. But quirky for you is doing some important work that I think is really unique.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, my daughter is 19, my oldest. And so when she was younger, she was my oldest, so I didn't really have any frame of reference for, appropriate, behavior at that age. So a lot of the things that she did were just kind of, fun and silly, and they were challenging too. But I think, quirky encompasses the idea that it's a good thing. It's not necessarily something we always need to be sad about or angry about or frustrated about, even though it does come with those aspects. But I do like the word quirky, and it kind of reminds me of my father, because my father was a quirky guy. He was, I think he was probably ADHD. I don't have confirmation of that, but, he would talk too loud and too long, and he would tell you all about, his favorite special interests. And so, I have a very fond, I guess, memory of that, and that word too kind of connotes the same thing to me.
Well, and I think this is, something that I've picked up on, and I can tell just from what the presser and everything that you have, you'll understand what I'm getting at. One of the things that you have that's unique when you get to talk about a quirky kid is to say you don't want them to feel like they need to change at all who they are, because right. God made them who they are. But you also have to say, hey, maybe at the job interview, maybe be mindful of, when quirkiness works out the best. And that seems to me one of the most interesting, prudential things as a parent that you're trying to offer to your children, is to say who you are is unique and wonderful. Also, people have expectations, and trying to be able to hold those two intentions, sort of with the Catholic both and, I think, is really important here.
Sure, yeah. I think it's a matter of giving them the tools to navigate a neurotypical world on their own terms. Understanding what the expectations are of a world that's not really built for them, and being able to adapt and, feel confident within themselves. This is the way I am. I am able to apply these skills that I've learned and, kind of fit these social norms, as I'm ready. And then, but also being true to themselves and to their identity in Christ.
Absolutely, and you talk about this with something, terms like emotional regulation, for instance, which has even in just developmental psychology has sort of had more day in the sun relatively recently in terms of even the science of all of these matters. And, that starts to be somewhat of a struggle, I think, sometimes for families with neurodivergent children is emotional regulation actually is a hard-won battle for all people as they grow up to figure that out. So what is it that, provides, an additional maybe challenges? But how is it that I think what you call it grace in the storm, right? How does that help us understand that aspect of this?
Well, I think it goes both ways. I think it goes for, parents and the kids themselves. So, when your child is having a meltdown or is having a hard time with, their sensory integration, they're feeling out of sync, the behavior can be kind of off the charts. And so, especially with a meltdown, they're long, they're dramatic, they're painful. It's much worse than a tantrum. And so being able to center yourself and just be present for your child in that moment when they are feeling so out of control. Because that can be a really hard thing to do. So, finding God's grace in that moment, that you are there for your child. God designed you specifically to be that child's parent, and finding that grace that he gives you. But then I think also, for the kids, helping them understand their bodies, their brains, the way all of that works, how it's all integrated, why they, may feel out of control or out of sync at times. And so being able to help them find their own grace in the storm, to know that it will pass, to know that the feeling isn't comfortable, but that there are things that they can do, places where they can seek help, strategies they can use to calm themselves down, to be aware of their emotions, and to, express them verbally instead of, feeling so out of control that they are, crying, flailing, kicking. So does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that, weaving together like you do neuroscience, lived experience, and then the lives of the saints, that's something, of course, not every book on neurodivergence is going to bring to it, but the Catholic angle specifically, what was it that, made you think this is a great way of, bringing these three things together will provide perspectives for parents that maybe they wouldn't get elsewhere?
Sure. I think probably I owe a lot of this to St. Zélie Martin because when I was a younger mother, and when I initially started, the Quirky Catholic Kids Ministry back in 2017, I came across, something that she said about how, if the day continues, I'll be dead by this evening. And it just spoke to me on a really visceral level. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is a saint, and the saint said this? And so I started looking deeper into it, and I learned about the Martin family, about Leonie, about Therese, and that's when it really dawned on me, God was like, my saints, they are people too, and they had these moments, and they had these challenges, and, if you look back in history, especially the history of the saints, there are so many of them who, while we don't know for sure, they definitely had behaviors and, habits that are kind of in line with certain aspects of neurodivergence. Even Carlo Acutis, who's hyper-focused on Eucharistic miracles. Yes, that's a grace for sure. But, clearly he has a single-minded focus that you really don't find
right.
in the standard typical person. So, and I think for me, because Catholicism is just so wrapped up in my life and who I am, it's hard not to separate them. I can't see them, any other way. So.
Absolutely wonderful. And that's sort of the last thing to sort of dwell on, right, is faith formation, of course, something that every parent thinks about and how we're going to bring along our kids in the faith. There's, of course, ways in which just learning in general can be very diverse in this group, and that goes for faith formation as well. So maybe you have a kid that, the rest of the class is sort of going along in a particular way. I know with my son, it seemed like he wasn't understanding something, and then it was like one night he downloaded all the information at once and then woke up and could just tell you everything. But so this starts to be this way of learning patience in faith formation might be one of the struggles that people on the other side, like you or me, who've had neurodivergent kids who are now entering into their adult phase, can say it does work. You just have to learn to be patient.
Yes, no, absolutely. And to understand that, every child develops in their own individual way. But I think also, being open to different learning styles and, different attitudes of learning and the way kids approach learning, especially neurodivergent kids, they can tend to be very black and white. So focusing on the concrete is really helpful for them. But then also, you take the more abstract aspects of our faith, and that's a little harder. But I always encourage parents, if they ask you questions, go to the source, go to the catechism, and really dig into why we believe what we believe, and let them know that it's okay if they feel like their faith looks different. Not everybody has to have kind of the emotional connection to their faith. Sometimes it's faith, it's logic, and that's fantastic because we are a church of faith and reason. So. I don't know. I hope that answers your question.
No, it absolutely does. And that's the one thing that I would definitely tell people is as much as it's very important, I know we talk about the heart and the emotional aspect of faith, and it makes sense in Lent. It's also very important to know that for some people, the fact that they can give answers to questions and it's in a structured way is precisely what will keep them in the faith. And that's just me talking from experience as well. Look, the book is absolutely wonderful. I'm so glad that you've done this. Quirky Catholic Kids, Navigating Neurodivergence with Faith and Joy, out by Sophia Press Institute. Virginia Kochis, thank you for coming on the Catholic Morning Show. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
You are welcome indeed. Blessings the rest of Lent.